Junji Ito needs no introduction. He's one of the greatest horror manga artists to ever grace this planet. He is the definition of horror manga for most people and is by far the strongest grasp over a singular genre of manga. He's one of the few manga artists to breach containment and gain mainstream recognition for something other than a major shonen series. And even more surprisingly, he's one of the very few manga artists to have basically their entire body of work translated into English. He's a truly one-of-a-kind talent in the manga industry, and with the horror season in full swing, what better task than to read every single manga Junji Ito has written, from Tomier to Slug Girl, Grease to Uzumaki, and everything in between. Before I begin in earnest, for those who want to read along, I'm grouping things by how Viz collects them because it is different from how my anime list groups them. I will be reading whatever has a complete English translation because there are still some holes in the catalog that aren't in English, but it's only a select few things. But without further ado, let's get into reading every Junji Ito work. The Suichi collection was the first one I read because, to be completely honest, he seemed the least threatening out of all the covers for the collections. Contrary to this sick, twisted plan for a video, I would not really describe myself as a horror person. However, by the end of Suichi, I grew a faint attachment to this weird freak who has way too many people in his life who can match his freak, or at least enable it. It's bad whenever most of his family is like, "Oh, Suichi, you can't go cursing your sister like that, it's not nice." And I'm here like, ma'am, your son is cursing his siblings and frankly is one too many hidden holes in this house. But for all of Suichi's antics, he's one of the few Junji Ito characters that is actually punished for their actions, even if it is just that it blows up in his face. It doesn't deflate how messed up he is, because he is very messed up, but it does make it a much more lighter read than most of the stuff ahead. But big rip to him for getting eaten by a mirror monster from Dawn to Dawn. Rest in pieces, buddy. You had a good run, but the scales tipped toward justice, I guess. Another one of Junji Ito's recurring characters does not face a similar fate, but Tomier does give a very clear picture of what to expect for basically every Junji Ito manga. The Tomier collection is a pretty good entry point for Junji Ito and all his quirks and flourishes as a writer and artist. Some of these are strong points like the body horror. Seeing Tomier grow out of other people is really gross every time. And then once she starts growing out of herself, it becomes these sickening worm-like abominations that strike fear into the hearts of man. The individual stories are at their best when we see these abominations consuming each other like a parasite. They're less Tomier and more just creatures. By the end of Tomier, I had no idea how many Tomiers there actually were, and honestly, it doesn't really matter. Men will continue to fall way too deeply in love with her and be driven insane until they kill her. However, that's also the biggest issue with Tomier, because some of the stories do begin to feel a bit repetitive as it's yet another man who falls in the same dark path. The best story from the collection is early on when a girl somehow gets one of Tomier's kidneys transplanted in her, and we see Tomier's head burst from the girl's stomach like some chest-bursting alien. It's such an interesting and gross piece of body horror that is a good primer and reminder that Junji Ito will do very many gross things to the human form in the name of making sick body horror. Before we continue down the rest of the longer Junji Ito stories that I'm sure you're all here for, we have to wade through the anthologies of short stories and a few longer ones that make up the large portion of Junji Ito's catalog. There will be a lot less deep discussions from these as their quality varies greatly and a good number are either sub 10 pages or just bad. But either way, it's not an I read every Junji Ito manga video without reading every Junji Ito manga. So let's begin with Deserter. Deserter, like most of these anthologies, is a mixed bag. I'm gonna split it up by content and not order because it's easier to talk about recurring ideas than to go, Biohouse was boring, The Devil's Logic was 10 pages, and Face Thief was confusing. Biohouse was boring, but only because it's a pretty typical vampire house story where who would have guessed but the family needs blood to survive. Somehow when I read it I didn't expect this, but in hindsight, it's the most obvious thing because it's a house of vampires. And speaking of spooky creatures, Villain of the Siren is not about the siren creature, but instead an actual demon, harnessing a horn that is a siren to hypnotize women into kidnapping children in order for a demon to be fully summoned. It's one of the rare traditional demons for Junji Ito. Admittedly, it still looks sick as hell. You can make the argument there are many other demons in Junji Ito's work, but this is the one that's most recognizably a devil. Spoilers, the demon wins and hypnotizes all women ever, and as such, men were no more. We had a good run, but we're dead. Where the Sandman Lives and Devil's Logic did the thing they set out to do and it was fine. Not much to report on those two. Similarly, Long Hair in the Attic is one that by the time you get through a lot more Junji Ito works, it just becomes a commonplace thing. Junji Ito really likes to use hair as a scary tool, and Long Hair in the Attic is definitely one of the weaker ones in that catalog. Father's Love falls into a similar camp for being a recurring thing, but for its length at 64 pages, it felt way too long. The concept of an overprotective father trying to take over the mind of his daughter is neat and a good horror extreme of an overprotective father, but it felt too drawn out for an idea that reaches its apex pretty early and will come up many, many more times in Junji Ito's work. Unendurable Labyrinth gets points for being scary, but it features a classic horror trope of some incredibly stupid people. The cult of the story has such terrible vibes in a good way, but the main cast going into a statue that they did not enter from but did pass by when they entered, when they tried to leave, is really frustrating, especially as an ending to the story. They move on to the confusing and bad ones. Face Thief is a premise that lends itself easily to confusion, which is kind of the point, but I lost track of who is the thief and who is the real one very quickly, and that took me out of it all. Reanimator's Sword lost me in its more fantastical premise, but I didn't hate it. I just got lost a bit, and that took me out of it. Anyways, on to the worst story of the anthology, Bullied. There's really no horror here, it's just a long con of bullying that doesn't really make the ending scary panel feel that worth it, which is probably just because the bullying overrides any semblance of good feelings. Because it's a thing normal humans experience and just doesn't feel to watch happen to someone in any capacity. Easily one of my least favorite stories, just in general. Lastly, we reach my two favorites for entirely different reasons. The titular deserter is an antithesis of sorts to bullying because this awful family decides to mess with a traumatized soldier staying with them by saying fireworks are an air raid. Thankfully, this guy is long dead and just a spirit haunting the family, but it feels very good to watch them get punished for just being terrible people. The scary panels are also just very effective, which lends itself to a solid singular story for Mr. Junji Ito. Conversely, we have Scripted Love, which was the story of the least parasocial Twitch viewer. But sometimes Junji Ito makes a concept that is just not scary, but very funny. And Scripted Love's ending being that the girl falls in love with her boyfriend in the TV and tells her actual human boyfriend to go away because he isn't that one in the TV is incredibly funny to me. That's the type of comment that ruins a man for the rest of his life, but as a reader it is hilarious. I'm going to tackle Love Sickness in reverse because a good chunk of it is the Love Sickness section that is a continuous storyline. However, there are 4 stories attached to it that are all just kind of bad. The Hikizuri siblings just did nothing for me. Mansion of the Phantom Pain is only funny because of... Rib Woman is a neat gimmick, but it's just fine in the end. And Memories of Real Poop didn't need to exist because the conclusion is that he's just embarrassed that he bought poop in public. Like a real piece of cinema, that one. Anyways, onto the main arc that takes up most of Love Sickness. Beautiful Boy at the Crossroads sets up the aforementioned boy who looks very cool and spooky, but is also killing people because whatever he tells them about their love life leads someone to die. The result being that a boy goes to investigate it and, whoa, turns out he's the Crossroad Boy, or so it seems. And then Woman in Distress through Scream of the Night continue this arc where the boy becomes increasingly known as the Crossroads Boy to the point that all the women are after him, until eventually they're just over him because he isn't giving them what they want. So instead an actual murderer steps in as the Crossroads Boy and kills all of the women, who then become ghosts and haunt the whole town until the former Crossroads Boy becomes the Boy in White, who just tells all the spirits they will find love one day, and voila, the story arc ends. My biggest issue with the Love Sickness storyline is that I kind of just feel bad for the kid because he's arguably killing people. He isn't intending to, but somehow through the Crossroads Boy distortions a bunch do. But then conversely, ending the story with him just telling all the women spirits that they'll find love and they vanish is such an anticlimactic ending to it all. But to some extent, that's what happens when the scale becomes too big, which you still want to try for a not doomed ending. It isn't super satisfying, but it at least ends somewhat happily. A lot of Junji Ito stories fall into a similar trap because it's a natural situation that's hard to wrap up nicely. Either you doom everyone to die or somehow everything is okay, and Love Sickness chooses the latter. But at the very least, the art for the whole storyline is great, which helps make looking at it at least enjoyable. Fragments of Horror is a pretty decent anthology, but it was also where I really began to see some of the overarching things Junji Ito just loves to draw. It's chock full of all of the things Ito loves to do, even if none of the entries in this anthology are the greatest examples of them. Wooden Spirit gives us some classic Junji Ito eyes that are so unsettling but still so cool to look at. Whispering Woman and Megami Nanakuse gave us some classic Junji Ito messed up women, albeit with entirely different motives. The former is just out for revenge, while the latter is just someone who loves messing people up. Megami Nanakuse is also a good place to talk about how a lot of Ito works require a good amount of suspension of disbelief to assume that yes, the entire town is being controlled by one woman and all of her cronies. But given that it's a horror story, I can do that quite easily. Dissection Chan gives us the classic Junji Ito body horror. Probably my least favorite type of the horror, just personally, but I have to accept that Ito is pretty damn good at drawing it. To completely pivot, we've still got some classic mid-stories in Futon and Blackbird. The former is just kinda gross for its one scare, and the latter is just not really my vibe. For our silly entry, there's Tomier with the man just holding his head to keep it attached. The entire story, and that's gross, but also very silly. And lastly, there's the wholesome supernatural element with Gentle Goodbye, where the spirits are just after images of people who have gone, who will one day fade away. The process of reading everything Junji Ito has written will inevitably lead to noticing patterns. Every artist has their favorite things, and Ito's are pretty easy to notice. But it does help humanize him for me, because ultimately he's just a guy making the stories who has to try and create new and interesting ones. And sometimes you just crack your knuckles and do something comfortable or fun, like drawing some good old body horror. Smashed is not the best anthology, but it does have the caveat of being the one that takes the simplest concepts to their horror extreme. I think there's merit in being able to take very simple concepts like dying of laughter to a horror extreme like in Ghosts of Primetime. It's such a common phrase, but Ito has somehow to make this unsettling story that works fairly well even if it's not an all-timer. Splendid Shadow Song similarly is just if a song getting stuck in your head could kill you, and he's able to make it work even if it is a little less effective as Ghosts of Primetime. Library Vision is just OCD taken to the extreme, but actually it's just a pissed off dad haunting his son to make him memorize a whole library. He's just the most petty father out there, apparently. Bloodsucking Darkness is even simpler because it's just bats. It's kind of how I envision the one Birds movie, but with bats. There's a strange subplot about a girl with an eating disorder and the bats trying to give her blood, which exists, but is just kind of odd. I Don't Want to Be a Ghost is strange because it's a girl who likes to eat ghosts, but the story ends with her eating a dead woman and her unborn child's ghost, which raises several red flags beyond just a woman who was obsessed with eating ghosts. The titular Smashed is also just kind of odd, but it's just a plant that's pissed off people are stealing from it, so who can blame the plant? Death Row Doorbell is another group of pissed off people, but instead it's a criminal haunting a family until he's executed. But it also unveils a darker side of the family who just start beating the life out of the spirit every single day because they can't forgive him for committing the crimes. Before we get into the two highlights, I have two more with cool premises but varying degrees of execution. Earthbound has people stand stuff in place because of their guilt. It's a cool idea for guilty people to get hit by the spiritual death note until they just turn to stone over their guilt. The plotline with the protagonist or police chief is very sus, but overall it's a cool concept for a story. In Mirror Valley is an interesting concept of two villages with some pretty big beef with each other, but it has such a funny ending that it makes it memorable, which is just because two villagers try to break the cycle and instead they get to have spiritual sex in front of everyone time and time again, which is the funniest way to end that story. And finally, for Smashed, Suichi returns. Our boy is back. Mystery of the Haunted House and Suichi's version of it are our return to Suichi after the exit from his collection. Turns out the lady that took him at the end of his collection is just his wife and steals him away. I got very excited to see Suichi and his wife back because it is just a funny pairing, but also a reoccurring character appearing in an anthology is always welcome, even if it just turns out that the whole arc was a dream. But then we get another story in Suichi's beloved pet. Beloved is doing a lot of work there, but it is really just another classic Suichi story where he's just a sick, twisted guy, but it blows up in his face, so it's funny in the end. I hesitate to say it's the most child-friendly Junji Ito, because I don't think that exists, but it is the simplest humor of any Junji Ito work, which makes it more approachable than many of the other stories. Mimi's Tales of Terror is the collection I have the least to talk about, but that's because it has the most 10 or less page stories, and also just because it kind of sucks. Utility Pole and Sign of the Field are just the same story with different objects and are both like 4 pages. Rustling in the Grass is just some gross horror and that's about it. Even the longer stories suffer from just not being very interesting. Seashore is the typical the sea tries to steal the souls kind of story with its only upside being a really cool spread of the empty lake. Scarlet Circle is just a spooky circle that makes a bad girl disappear. Even the ones that are vaguely interesting are only because of one singular detail. Woman Next Door is only interesting because it has what looks like a ruler woman. She's like a measuring stick or something. Or just like a weird Inspector Gadget body that's cool to think about. I don't really know how it works in practice, but it's at least a cool image. Grave placement gets points because the bodybuilder's just kind of a freak for getting an exercise high, having spirits watch him work out. It isn't really scary, it's just like a go off king, like whatever works, man. Just the two of us gets points because the art of the charred spirit is pretty good, even if the plotline is not interesting. The one good story from Mimi's Tales of Terror is the one that's repeated in Tombs, and that's the bloody story of Shirosuna. The concept of a town that is alive and actively sucking the blood of its residents in a sort of tree sucking nutrients from the earth kind of way is very cool. The imagery of the arteries and such flowing throughout the town is very neat and gross, and the final act being one severed and just going feral is very nice, and I liked it a lot. It's easily the best of the collection, but that is a very low bar for Mimi's Tales of Terror. Tombs features the most whelming degree of stories, but is also the home to the first repeat story and one of the absolute weirdest ones Junji Ito has made. We've got Bloody Story of Shirosuna, which is just a repeat from Mimi's Tales of Terror. But beyond that, there are a few stories in Tombs that were scary and a lot that were just kind of silly. Strange Tale of the Tunnel was probably not supposed to be as funny as it was, but it was only because I kept thinking of it as like people clipping through the ground like in a video game, and not people being consumed by the tunnel. Although putting the latter out into the world is still kind of funny. Bronze Statue was similarly silly, but I'll always take a Secco Boys reference, even if it most certainly isn't one. Washed Ashore was less silly, but that was mainly just because I thought the big fish was keeping everyone who was drowning alive by storing them in its massive belly. Once they spilled out, it was a bit funny how many poured out, but that was offset by the fact that it just kind of didn't end. I'd rather just have a bad ending to a story than one that feels like it was just severed from the ether and put out into the world. Clubhouse, however, was not lacking an ending, but its ending was up to interpretation in a way that kind of lost me. There's the obvious interpretation of being stuck between life and death, but I also felt like there was something more going on there that I didn't quite understand. Floaters was not lacking in the comprehension department, but it also just felt like a tried and true Junji Ito story where a thing appears, causes mass hysteria by exploiting the frailty of the human mind, and then just takes over and destroys the world. I don't hate these stories, they're usually pretty good, but Floaters felt like I'd already experienced a story or two like it. Same with Windows Next Door, which was another one that felt all too familiar, but that was mainly because it was another Ito creepy woman who exists for one singular story. This one, however, is a house, or maybe specifically a window, it's hard to say. Now we have the good story from Tombs, and then the really gross one. The former is the titular Tombs, which is an interesting concept of people turning into tombs when they die. It's a bit comical how inconveniently placed so many are, but I also really like that Ito stipulates that they had to pass in a specific way in order to become a fully fledged tomb. This gives them that easy layup for adding some gross body horror when it turns out the ones that don't get fully turned into tombs are these like gross crystal creatures that are a bit sickly but have a really cool design. It's not an inherently complex story, but it does a job well in various ways that makes it feel fulfilling and enjoyable to read. And last we have Slug Girl, one of the grossest stories I have read. I don't know what Ito was on for this one, but it is very gross. The girl's tongue turning into a slug is already very gross, but the ending of the story is a special type of gross and especially weird. But it's also one where I would love to know the backstory behind it, because how did you think of this, Junji Ito? How did you get here? I want to know. I want some answers. Venus in the Blind Spot has the tagline best of best on my anime list, and I really don't think you should name things like that in general. But I will give Venus in the Blind Spot credit for being pretty good in comparison to many other anthologies. There are still some mid ones like The Sad Tale of the Principal Post and Unearthly Love and How Love Came to Prester Kirita, which execute their premise well enough but are not nearly as noteworthy as the other entries. The Human Chair is another men are gross and perverted and need to be put down kind of story. The titular Venus in the Blind Spot is another such case but differs because it is perhaps the most Junji Ito story. It's about perverted men who are obsessed with a woman who they can't see, but it turns out is actually being blocked by an overprotective dad who has manipulated them to be unable to see her, and in the end the men brutally kill her for no good reason. And admittedly it works well together in a way that I was surprised by. Billions Alone is very similar to a Hannibal episode I've seen like 3 times because I was trying to get other people to watch it, and I always started the season that I was on. but Hannibal makes it more artistic, whereas Ito makes it this human blob flooding the world with people sewn together. The Licking Woman gives us a classic grotesque story about the world's most gross-looking tongue licking people with its poison or something. It made me very uncomfortable, so congrats on that one, Junji Ito. The Enigma of Amigara Fault is a pretty typical story until there's the classic meme of the "this is my hole, it was made for me" panel that immediately had me laughing. Keepsake fares much the same, except it ends with a full-page spread of Ito staring at the manuscript with a face that says, "What the hell did I just make?" And honestly, he should just put that after more stories because it was hilarious. And lastly, I want to talk about Master Umezu and Me, which is not a horror story at all. It's an autobiographical story from Ito about how growing up loving Umezu's horror manga. It's a very earnest and heartwarming story, but also a good connecting piece to put together the puzzle that is Junji Ito as a manga artist. Admittedly, I did add some Umezu manga to my reading list because I kind of just assumed all horror manga was from Junji Ito, but it was nice to see how Ito's carrying on the genre of horror manga that Umezu helped pioneer. Junji Ito is a very fascinating manga artist, so it was really nice to get to see him engage with one of his major influences and the unabashed love for him that Junji Ito had growing up. Lional Zone is the shortest anthology, but it's also a very strange one. Weeping Woman Way takes the idea of mourners crying in groups to a horror extreme where some people just cry for hundreds of years to deal with the spirits. It's a simple concept, but the execution was odd even if it made sense in my head. It's also just a bit funny seeing a dead body crying and then knowing that they've been doing it for like 100 years. Slumber is a more psychological story, but it ends up being a serial killer story with a twist. Madonna makes the case for a Junji Ito and Mike Flanagan collab, which I need to happen, because Madonna feels like it could be a piece of Midnight Mass or like a companion story to that world, and I would love that. Despite the name, it's a religious horror story where the cultists find their new Mary, but the old woman in charge refuses to accept it because she thinks she's already Mary. The initial impression of Madonna has a very different impression of it since it makes me think music, but I'm always down for some religious obsession horror. And last we have the spirit flow of Aokigahara, deeply silly about guys becoming worms by soaking in the spirit juice. The big reveal at the end of the story showing all the other worm guys up there with one of the reveals that made me laugh the hardest. Junji Ito may be a horror guy, but the perk of having so many random ideas is that some are just really funny, even if that might not be the intent. I'm going to save the actual Frankenstein section of the Frankenstein anthology for last because it's broken up pretty nicely into Frankenstein Oshikiri and then everything else. Everything else consists of Hell of Doll Funeral, which features dolls, which are my least favorite type of horror, and I don't like them. Face Firmly in Place is pretty self-explanatory. Boss Non and Hide and Seek are just one-shots that I'll talk about later. Oshikiri is probably the worst recurring protagonist Ito has made, but I think this is because he isn't as quirkily evil as someone like Tomier or Suichi. He's more or less just a normal guy who's abrasive and kind of an awful human being. His whole conundrum is that his house holds many dimensions and many versions of himself, which his house is probably composed of more dead versions of himself than his family than actual bricks, which is a weird thought to think about. The highlight of the Oshikiri section is when one of his alternate selves gets experimented on becomes this like bony centipede looking thing that is incredibly gross and highlighted by the fact that it is still talking. There is a much stranger chapter, which is where a school group comes with Oshikiri to his house and finds their alternate dimension corpses and are just kind of fine with it. I can't imagine handling seeing a dead version of myself any way close to as well as they do, where they just kind of move on. But I guess I'm just not built like them. Oshikiri suffers because he really just needs to be evil and exaggerated. It's a good change of pace to try a more normal recurring protagonist, but Oshikiri pales in comparison to Tomier or Suichi, whereas Oshikiri just kind of reacts to everything, and what makes someone like Suichi or Tomier work is that they're just instigators of everything happening. And now we get to Frankenstein, the best case for Junji Ito to adapt more monster stories. I would hesitate to say this is the best Frankenstein adaptation I've ever experienced, but it is really good, even if only because of Junji Ito's art. He makes Frankenstein look uniquely messed up, but still human enough to feel for him. And once you add in Ito's propensity for gore, it really adds to the brutality of Frankenstein for the sake of finding someone to love him. Ito has such a skill at drawing monsters that I would love to see him adapt so many more of these stories, even if they are only a few chapters. However, me specifically, I would kill for him to adapt the Portrait of Dorian Gray, because I know that Portrait of Dorian Gray would be the most vile thing my eyes have ever laid witness to, and that makes me so excited. If the Frankenstein collection was just Frankenstein, it would be pretty good, but unfortunately everything else drags it down. The other sections either overstay their welcome or are just not interesting enough to justify being tacked onto a collection named Frankenstein. It's basically the same as what happened in Love Sickness, where the extra stories added on to the end hamper the overall quality due to just not being very interesting. This section is just to fill in some holes because there are a few stories that are not collected into an anthology. They're mainly just stories about Ito and his pets, but there's still Inagawa's ghost story, which is just whatever. It's a pretty typical Ito horror story with much of nothing to note. Yonamu gives us some look into the hijinks of Junji Ito's cats. He clearly loves them a lot, but he is so good at showing the true cat experience by making them so creepy, but also these silly little guys. It's nice to peel back the curtain and see that Ito is at least to some extent a normal guy. The other story about his pets is Nonon Oyabon, which is by far the strangest send-off to a dead pet I've ever come across. It has a similar vibe to Yonamu, where he clearly does love his dog, but also the moments where the dog annoys him. It's also collected at the end of Frankenstein, which is such a tonal jump from everything else. All this horror to suddenly being like, here's my dog. I can't really put these as a whole. Like, there's no collection of these. It's just nice to see a little look behind the curtain and see Ito having fun drawing his pets, because we all should be entitled to do that whenever we want. Shiver is by far the best anthology, but for a very specific reason. It's the anthology that made you the most uncomfortable by a very large margin. Mathematically, it makes sense that eventually there'd be some stories that would gross me out. There are over 100 of them. But Shiver is almost half full of things that grossed me out or made me uncomfortable, which is way more than usual. Which you would think would mean I didn't enjoy it, and you'd be partially right. I didn't enjoy reading Shiver, but it was the first collection to make me feel genuinely uncomfortable, which is a massive step for Ito. At best, he manages a story or two that grossed me out, but here he was firing on all cylinders. But before we get to that, let's get the other interesting stories out of the way. Used Record is pretty much another song that's stuck in your head, but it kills you. It's fine, cool idea executed well enough. Fashion Model and Fashion Model Cursed Frame are Fuchi stories where she just wants to be a star and is scary looking. She just also happens to rip apart women who she gets jealous of, but you know, the path to the top's a bloody one. The Long Dream is another cool idea of someone who is basically just absorbing the expanses of the universe until he passes it on to the next person who will eventually erode into dust and do the same thing again and again because the universe is just too much weight. Painter is just the story from Tomier that may or may not be a little different. I read them too far apart to be completely certain my brain wasn't just reading the same thing again, but it probably is just the same thing. Hanging Blimp was a longer story, but was equal parts kind of silly, but also very messed up. The idea is that these people are being killed by big balloon versions of themselves that hang them. It looks very silly when reading it, but it's also very messed up when you realize they've been lynched. But it's an interesting idea that is enjoyable to read even if it is very messed up. Now we enter the stuff that I felt varying degrees of uncomfortable to incredibly grossed out by. To begin with is Marionette Mansion, which gets at the fact that I do not enjoy horror with dolls or marionettes. Something about it just like primally creeps me out. However, Ito's author's comment from this one was very funny, which balanced it out a bit. The titular Shiver is both a bug and a hole story. I'm not the biggest afraid of holes guy, but when it's paired with bugs, I did not enjoy it. It made me very uncomfortable, but less so than Honored Ancestors, which isn't a bug horror, but there is a brain centipede looking thing in it. It's like a head duplicating itself on top of each other, but it looks very much like a centipede and is very gross and uncomfy, and I did not like it. However, none of the stories compare to Greased, which is a precision strike on the thing that makes me the most uncomfortable. Pimple popping is the grossest thing in the world, and I hate every second thinking about it. And Greased is just that for an entire chapter. It was vile, sickening, and every other adjective you can use like that. And even just thinking about it makes my skin crawl, and I am going to stop now. Overall, Shiver is great in a sick person way, but it is also the only anthology with author's notes for each story, which is a great insight into how Ito's mind works, and is how I figured it worked, but was glad to get confirmation, because most of the author comments are functionally, I had an idea and twisted it into a horror short story, which makes complete sense that this is approach, but it was fulfilling to have my assumption validated. So many of the prior short stories just felt like they were an idea that Ito had and put onto the page, and I respect that creative process even if not all the stories are hits. He's made over 100 of these things. It's hit or miss on how many are actually good, but he's making art and very clearly has amassed a fan base for making that art. Even if many aren't for me, I respect his craft and his dedication to making almost exclusively horror manga. And with that, we are free of the anthologies. Honestly, they're an incredibly mixed bag, but that's also bound to happen when there are over 100 unique stories. Not everything can be an all-time classic. The anthologies do make up most of Ito's work, but they're also great comparison points for the longer stories. He gets more room to let ideas and concepts simmer before bringing them to a conclusion. Instead of being forced to begin and end in a story in the same chapter, you can let it grow until it becomes as expansive as the universe, like with Remina or Censor. Remina is a very silly story, but not in a bad way. It is my favorite type of Junji Ito horror, which is cosmic horror. He's very good at making these expansive entities that have a certain type of horror to them, but aren't quite able to be put into words. The planet Remina looks absolutely incredible. It's so gross and looks so alive despite being this massive entity consuming planets. It's kind of like Galactus, except Remina looks more like what I would picture for a consuming planet. The silly part of Remina comes from all the human characters, mostly just in the latter third of the story. Once Remina actually gets to Earth and starts messing around with it, the story becomes this massive Wii Sports Resort intro cutscene where everyone is just flying across the page. It makes sense in the context of the story, but it is still very funny to see a horde of people flying across the page to kill the girl who is also named Remina. Like with most larger-than-life entity stories like Godzilla or King Kong, the humans are the weakest part of Remina, but at least it's funny to watch them unfold their little antics as they try to survive. Censor is another longer story that has some great Junji Ito cosmic horror, but this time in a much less planetary destruction kind of way. Censor has a large scale, but it excels at never feeling too out there. Remina kind of falters because it gets way too big to be serious, but Censor keeps itself rooted firmly while delivering a pretty engaging narrative. The golden hair progression and manipulation throughout the story makes sense, but never feels too grandiose until the final act where time travel ends up involved. The narrator for Censor is also just a normal guy, but this time isn't an active damperment to the whole experience, which helps a lot. He's not particularly noteworthy, but he exists and doesn't hurt the story. My biggest gripe with the story as a whole is that the ending is very open in a, well, the battle has just begun kind of way, which admittedly is still pretty conclusive for Junji Ito. I do wish the narrator was just like a little more interesting, but on the whole I enjoyed Censor a good bit. Ito is good at making longer stories, he just needs a little time to actually develop the premises and do things with it. And Censor is given time to progress, and sure enough, it's better than the vast majority of the short stories. Black Paradox is one of my favorite Junji Ito stories, but it's also the one I think M. Night Shyamalan should read because I think he'd have a blast making it into a movie. It's such an odd premise, but it works so well in every facet. The cast all want to die and try to do so with a weird portal to another world, like some kind of isekai thing. But by the end, it's like a...
What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
Black Paradox also has some great cosmic horror and some interesting philosophical topics. The aforementioned Suicide Squad give up their souls to explore this vast unknown universe, but in doing so are progressing society by helping harness a new power source. It raises the question of if you would give up your soul for the sake of progress, which is kind of just how society is now, except there isn't any actual process. It's just awful AI stuff that does nothing useful and only kills the planet faster. We're going to take a brief detour from original Junji Ito works for one of his rare adaptations, where I'd like to congratulate Dazai for being able to drag down a Junji Ito manga alongside all the women that happens to and No Longer Human. It's a profoundly depressing read because there's just nothing here that feels like Ito. The grossest things are these various sex scenes that do not look consensual and are by far the worst moments of the story. He's just a man possessed who drags everything and everyone down with him until it's all broken and he's just a shell of a human being. It's impressive how little of Junji Ito can be felt in No Longer Human. There are the spirits and some weird looking people, but it just doesn't feel like Ito at all. Like, where are all the weird creatures or ideas? Why is there so much sex? Because it's not really a thing that happens in many Junji Ito stories, especially not in as graphic of detail as it does in No Longer Human. If it does, it's usually just off the screen or unseen, but here it's just front and center and feels gross to watch. I just kind of feel bad for Ito because he can't really flex any of his muscles here. It's the most sanitized I've ever seen a Junji Ito work, to the point that I kind of hate it. Dazai's oppressive story takes all the soul out of Ito's style that makes me feel so profoundly sad. Not because it's bad, but because it feels the least like a Junji Ito work. I've saved the best for last with Guio and Uzumaki. I figure that's why most of you are here, so I saved them for the end. It was also for myself because I figured it was the best chance that these are the two best ones, and I wanted to end this on a good note. Or I wish I did that because I actually ended with No Longer Human, and it made me sad to end on that, so I am choosing to not do that. Guio is peak Junji Ito, but in a way that blends itself together effortlessly. It's kind of impressive how there are all the tried and true Junji Ito tropes, but they all flow together in a single package. There's some grotesque body horror, an obsessive scientist creative abomination, spirits haunting the dead, fish spiders, and so much more. The creature designs for Guio are incredible, especially the added twist of them being corpses stuck in limbo because a machine is just making them crawl until their mortal frames literally can't handle anymore. And then they upgrade into a human spider machine and it's just even more grotesque. The ending, like most of the stories, is not very conclusive. For the issue as a whole, those fish spiders and stuff are still out there, but it gives closure to a rare, actually good human from a Junji Ito work. Our protagonist roots the story in their desire to save their girlfriend, which for all the grandiose creatures, the story is ultimately focused on that relationship. And so even if Japan is still run over by fish spiders, at least the main couple got some closure. There's a good reason Uzumaki is the work Junji Ito is most known for. Unsurprisingly, it's his best work. It features the scariest Junji Ito, but uses the least amount of actual scary creatures. The spiral force is barely seen, and even when we see it, it barely makes a difference on how we feel about it. Even without having a physical presence, is this all-consuming force that you can only run from. There's no defeating it, only completing it. It's another classic doomed ending, but it feels fitting for how vast and oppressive the spiral has become by the end of the story. This cosmic entity begins with small spirals before enveloping any and everyone that comes within its field of view. There's some great body horror, but also just some great cosmic horror. The people slowly turning into snails because they can't run from the spiral fast enough is such a great blend of so many different types of horrors, while still staying true to the premise of spirals. It's really impressive just how far Ito takes that simple concept of a spiral and makes it into such an oppressive force that feels even scarier than many of the other actual horrors we've seen in his works. Uzumaki is Junji Ito firing on all cylinders in a story that deserves its place as his magnum opus. The scariest thing he's made by far, but also the most holistically pretty great. Junji Ito is a fascinating manga author to me because he's so thoroughly in his own lane. He's just making horror manga and having a grand old time doing it. What was the most enjoyable part of this project was being able to slowly piece together Junji Ito the artist, finding the things he loves to draw, the things he repeatedly uses as plot points, his ability to make anything seem incredibly creeping and off-putting, and the list goes on and on. I don't really enjoy horror art, and I definitely went into this dreading some of it. By the end, I still don't enjoy body horror, but I can at least appreciate Junji Ito's skill at drawing it. One of the great joys of being alive is being able to experience art, to expose ourselves to stories we don't always want to. We can spend our whole lives just endlessly feasting upon art that we already love, but there's meaning to searching beyond the horizon. We may not be altering some grand destiny by doing so, but it broadens our horizons for art as a whole. I may have not had favorable opinions on a good chunk of Junji Ito's anthologies, but I found things I like or at the very least appreciated. And there's value in searching for things like that, to go beyond disliking things you don't experience and giving them a chance. Art is all about experiencing things for yourself and forming your own opinions on them, and after reading all of Junji Ito's horror manga, I've grown to appreciate them, even if I really don't enjoy being grossed out.